G'day, I'm Yuki-san Dev, and in part 26 of the series Unity for the Absolute Beginner, we will work on phase 2 of our second game. Alrighty, so we are continuing on from phase 1 where we set up the basic gameplay scene and made some enemies and a wave spawner. Today we will get a player in and configure it to move and fire bullets. Also we can now script our seeker enemy to do its thing, and we will also script a trigger for the enemies to be destroyed when hit by the player bullets enough times. So let's get straight into it. Okay, so I'm going to open up the project where we left off in the previous video. So firstly I realized after I'd already recorded the last video that the background was actually scrolling the wrong way. So quick fix, just jump into your move background script and put a minus in front of offset in the texture line and save, and a quick run to test. Sweet. So on to today's stuff. So let's start by getting a player in. So let's click Window and Asset Store. Alrighty, and do a search for Starfighter. And you might have to list the search results by price from lowest to highest. And you need to be choosing this one here. Click Add to add it to your assets. And then click Open in Unity. You can always replace this model with a different one later if you want to. Then click Download. And then import into your project. And close your package manager. So now you should see a folder named Starfighter. Drag that folder into your imported folder. And drop down the imported folder down and the Starfighter folder down, and click on the Starfighter and drag it into your hierarchy. Alright, first let's get the texture on this thing. So click on the Starfighter in the hierarchy and drop down the shader. Change standard to mobile bumped diffuse. And then drag the diff image into the base RGB. And drag normal into normal map. Alright, now let's do the usual stuff. So we'll reset its transform. Rotate it 180 degrees on Y. And 90 degrees on Z. And lock XYZ of scale and scale it down to 0.15. And move it down the screen to the bottom. I'm going to set mine to minus 3.5 on the Y-axis. Okay, it will need a collider, so add a component, and this time we'll add a sphere collider. And then click to edit the bounding volume. I'm just going to drag it a bit closer to the nose. Just remember, whatever hits this collider will kill the player, so you want to get it kind of right. And now let's rename the Starfighter to Player. And we'll give it the built-in tag Player. And finally, let's make a C# script for it and name it Player. And drag it onto the player in the hierarchy. Alrighty, now click on the player and select Prefab and Unpack. This will break the link from the original model. And now drag the player into your prefabs folder. We won't delete it from the scene just yet. We're still going to need it. Okie dokie, so the player will need a bullet to fire. So let's just copy the enemy bullet and we'll just change its color and tag. So drag the enemy bullet prefab into the hierarchy. And rename it to player bullet. And remove the enemy script component from it. And let's create a new tag. and name it player bullet, and add that to it. And let's also make a new material for the bullet color. So right click in your materials folder and add a new material and call it green, and change its color to green. And now drag the material onto the player bullet to replace the red one. Cool, and it's going to need its own script, so let's create a C# script and name it player bullet and drag it onto the bullet. Now open the enemy bullet script and copy all the code inside the class. Then open player bullet and paste what you copied inside the class to replace all the other default code. Cool, now we just need to change the direction of the bullet to go up rather than down. And change the boundary to the top of the screen, so 6.1f. And finally change the less than sign to the greater than sign. Alrighty, and save. And we'll give it a quick run to just make sure it goes up. Cool. So now we can drag the player bullet into the prefabs folder to create an original prefab, not a variant. And delete the bullet from the scene. Alrighty, so let's get to work on the player. So first drag the player to the right side of the screen edge of the border so we can figure out the boundary for movement. We don't want the player to be able to move off the screen. I'm going to go with 6.95. And so the left will of course be minus 6.95. Alrighty, let's open the player script. Okay, we'll start with the movement first. So we'll use transform for this. So let's do private float horizontal. And then the movement boundary private float move boundary x equals 6.94f. And the speed serialized field private float move speed equals 10. And now we can remove the start method, we won't be needing that. Alright, and now an update, let's move it with inputs. So horizontal equals input dot get axis horizontal. And then transform dot translate vector3 dot up times time dot delta time times move speed times horizontal. And now we need to limit the movement on the sides with if transform dot position dot x is greater than move boundary x, and then in between the curlies transform dot position equals new vector3 move boundary x comma transform dot position y. And then else if transform dot position dot x is less than minus move boundary x, and in between those curlies transform dot position equals new vector3 minus move boundary x comma transform dot position dot y. Alright, that's basic movement set up. Now for the firing. Well, first we need the bullet, so public game object player bullet. And now an update, let's fire with the space bar. So if input dot get key down keycode dot space, and in between the curlies instantiate player bullet comma transform dot position comma player bullet dot transform dot rotation. Cool, so when the spacebar is pressed, the script will instantiate the bullet object at the position of the player, and it will keep its original rotation. So let's save this. And now click on the player in the hierarchy and drag the player bullet into the object field we just created. Now, just in the meantime, to test our player out, let's click on the spawner and disable it so that it won't spawn. Alright, let's test this out. Okay, moving left and right, and stops at the boundaries, and fires when we press the spacebar. Okay, so there are a couple of issues here. One is that we can spam fire really fast. We probably want to prevent that, or the game might be a bit easy. Also, if I zoom in here, you can see that the bullet is being instantiated a little bit behind the nose of the player. So we could add an offset to the instantiate line to move it up a little bit. Alright, let's stop this and get back into the player script. Alrighty, so let's fix the bullet positioning with an offset variable. So let's do private vector3 bullet offset equals new vector3 and then 0, 0.4f. We're just offsetting the y value in this case. And now in our instantiate code, just add that offset to the transform position with plus bullet offset. Cool, now the bullet will instantiate a little bit up from the player position. Now, spam firing prevention. Lots of ways you could do this. We'll just do a quick one using time.time. We will want a variable that we can change the fire rate with, so let's do serialize field, private, float, fire rate, and then we need to keep track of it with a variable for the weight, so private, float, fire weight. And now in update, let's just add a line to our fire bullets code above the instantiate line. Fire weight equals time.time plus fire rate. And then just after the second to last bracket in the if line, add 2 ampersands, and then time.time is greater than fire weight. Cool, so now pressing the spacebar will only instantiate a bullet if time is greater than the fire rate. If it is, then the next time before you can fire again is updated by adding time to the fire rate. So for example, if you set the fire rate to 1, then you would only be able to fire roughly once per second. Time.time is actual time elapsed. If you want to see the difference between time.delta time and time.time, then you could put a couple of debugs in here to see the output. Okay, I think we can save this now and get back into the editor. And click on the player and let's set a value for the fire rate. So 1 second is obviously way too slow, so let's go with roughly 1/3 of a second. So let's try 0.3. Alright, and now play. Cool, no more spam firing. You hit the spacebar as fast as you can, but it will only let you fire every 0.3 seconds. And now if I zoom in here, yep, bullet is instantiating in a better place now on the player with that offset value we set. Cool. So that's the player for the time being. Now we made changes to this player object in the hierarchy after we dragged it in to create the prefab of it. So you'll notice if you click the player in your prefabs folder that the player bullet has no object and fire rate is 0. So let's click on the player in the hierarchy again and apply the changes we made back to the original prefab. So click overrides and apply all. Cool. So now if you click the player in your prefabs folder, you'll see the changes have been applied. Alrighty, let's get our enemy seeker scripted in now that it has something to seek. So let's open up our enemy script. Alright, so the seeker will need its own force variable, so let's do serialize field, private, float, seeker force equals 5f. And we need a variable to hold the reference of the player to seek, so private, game object, player. And then in start, let's find the player with player equals game object dot find, and then in speech marks player, and make sure we spell it as the player is named. We will change player to player clone later on. Right now it's already in the hierarchy, so it's just named player. Alright, and we already have our switcher set from the last video, so we just need to script the coroutine. So scroll down to the follow player routine that we made, And take out our temporary line of returning null, and let's do while true, and in between the curlies, yield return new, wait for seconds, 0.1f, just a split second pause to stop the loop from locking the game up, and don't forget to put this line in. And now we need to check if the player actually exists before we can follow it, so if player is not null, and that's represented with the exclamation mark equals, and in between those curlies, enemy rb.addForce player.transform.position minus transform.position dot normalized times seeker force. And then else, and in between those curlies, enemy rb.addForce vector3.down times seeker force. Alright, so we need the if player exists, because if a seeker tries to follow the player when it doesn't exist, then there will be errors. So it's just a safeguard. So if the player is not null, i.e. it does exist, then add force in the direction of the player minus the enemy, and the push force of seeker force. The normalized in easy speak terms is just to keep the movement smooth and not erratic. And then the else is if the player is not found, then just travel straight down the screen. Alright, let's save this. Now click on the seeker object in your project window and drop rigid body down and change its drag to 0.3. Why? Because the iron numerator is running constantly, and even though we have normalized the movement, the seeker will still get faster. So we have to set a little drag on it. So we have the iron numerator pausing for 0.1 seconds before movement. Then the force for movement we've set to 5. And lastly, friction or drag is set to 0.3. So these three items you could play with to get your desired effect and response times. You could even make the wait time in the iron numerator a variable if you wanted to, so you could tweak the number in the inspector. Also remember, when this game is compiled to play outside the editor, it will run a little quicker. Alrighty, so let's re-enable the spawner if you had it disabled. And drag the enemy seeker into the first wave pool so the seekers will spawn in the first wave. And play. Leave the player where it is, and the seekers, no matter where they spawn from, should head towards the player. And play it again and move the player around a little, and the seekers should try to follow it. Cool. Now stop the game and delete the player from the hierarchy and play it again. And the seekers all just travel straight down because there's nothing to seek. And the script is following the else statement that we made. Cool. Well, we're getting close to bringing in the game manager to control the actual game now. Just a few more things to set up. I think the next logical step is triggers and collisions. Let's do the enemy first. So let's get back into the enemy script. Alright, well, we'd like to get some points for killing the enemy, right? And each enemy should give different amounts of points. So let's do a variable for that with serialized field, private int award points. And let's see, maybe some enemies require more than one hit to die. So let's do a variable for that, serialized field, private int hits to kill. Well, actually, since both of these are private integers, we can put both of them on the same line. And we'll need to track how many times this enemy has actually been hit. So private int hit count. Alright, our enemies are using triggers. So way down the bottom of the class, let's do private void on trigger enter collider other. So the only thing that can hurt an enemy is the player bullet. So we need to make sure that what it's colliding with is indeed the player bullet. If we didn't check, then for sure the shooter enemy for one would kill itself just by shooting, and that wouldn't be good. We already gave the player bullet the tag player bullet, so we can just use that. So let's do if other.compare tag, and in speech marks player bullet, spelt the same way as we did in the tag. And then in the curlies, we need another if to check whether the enemy has been hit enough times to be killed yet. So firstly, we will add 1 to the hit count, because the enemy was of course hit. Then if hit count equals hits to kill, and in between the curlies, destroy the bullet and destroy the enemy instance. Then if it hasn't been hit enough times to be killed, then only destroy the bullet. So else destroy other game object. So real quick, this code here only runs when the enemy collides with something. It makes sure that it's a player bullet, since that's all that can hurt it. If it is, add 1 to hit count. And if it's been hit enough times to die, then destroy this enemy and the bullet. Otherwise, enemy carries on and just the bullet is destroyed. Alrighty, let's save this. Now we need to select each enemy and specify how many hits it's going to take to kill each one. So I'm going to set my normal to be hit only once. Shooter needs to be hit twice. Seeker needs to be hit twice. And I'll leave Free Mind as 1, since he's probably pretty hard to shoot. You can of course set these how you please. And I haven't set any award points yet. We will do that later, because that won't actually make any difference until the game manager is in place. Alright, so let's test this out. So drag a player from your prefabs folder into your hierarchy and play. And here come the seekers. Have to shoot them twice. Yep. Alright, looks good. Now, when the enemy hits the player, we haven't done anything, because we will do that in the player script. But it's better to do that when our game manager script is in place, so we can get the player to respawn back in until all the lives are lost, expended. Okay, let's do one more thing in preparation for the game manager to start handling things. Let's get into the spawner script. And we're just going to make a public function in here that the game manager will be able to call to start the spawner when it needs to. So just below the start method, let's do public void start spawn. And in between the curlies, we're just going to start the coroutine spawn waves. Cool. And save. Alrighty, so I'm going to stop here because the next step is the game manager. And this is where the game mechanics will change a little bit, so it's best done in a dedicated video. So a quick recap. We got a player model spaceship from the asset store. We scripted it to move and shoot, and we put a little bit of code in there to control the firing rate. We also scripted our seeker to move in the direction of the player and made sure that the player exists before it even tries to prevent errors. We configured the enemy so it only gets hurt by player bullets and put an option in there to specify how many times that the enemy needs to be hit before it dies. And we just quickly added a publicly accessible function to the spawner to allow the game manager to run the spawner when it needs to. And again, I'm going to do a little slideshow here of the code that we did today with rem statements, just to help you along. So in the next video, we will create the game manager and start linking all this stuff up. Probably going to include things like keeping score, controlling the waves by score, pausing between waves, tracking player lives, holding functions of what to do when a player gets hit or destroys an enemy, etc, etc. It will also control most of the GUI stuff, which will come later as well. And again, I will try to get this one out as soon as I can. So I hope to see you in the next installment of this game.